Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matthias Risser. I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and I'm delighted to be here with Jean Pfaelzer today for this episode in our series on Carr in Conversation. In fact, this is the second conversation we're having with Jean, except the other one wasn't in the series, but we also did a podcast about her fascinating work, namely, well, specifically this book here, California, a Slave State, and California, a Slave State is also the title of the talk today. Jean is an award-winning historian, a professor emerita of English, Asian Studies, and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware. And generally, her work seeks to give voice to individuals and experiences that have been overlooked or silenced for far too long in American history. She's also very much a public intellectual who makes regular appearances at places like the Smithsonian Museum, the Library of Congress, PBS, and NPR, and the Carr Center. And since this is the second in a relatively brief period of time. This book, California Slave State, really is one of the most fascinating, eye-opening, and also depressing things I have read in quite some time. It really shakes up your understanding of California, and therefore also California being an important part of the United States, of certain dynamics of human oppression in the United States, and also certain cliche understandings that one might have had about how this is all neatly lined up in a north-south dimension, and California is the golden state on the other end of the continent that has an aura of innocence around it, where everything was different, and everything actually wasn't different in California. So, but with that, please share a warm welcome of applause with me for Jean.
Thank you. Have my own? Yeah. Thank you, Matthias, for welcoming me and setting this up. I also want to give big recognition to Karen Clopton, who was head of the Human Rights Commission in San Francisco and engaged with me on many conversations and the opportunity to testify before the Human Rights Commission in San Francisco on reparations, and has really shifted my sense of the need for reparations, the costs of reparations, the politics, the complicated politics of reparations. So my thinking about this talk and the access to justice that was demanded by every group who was enslaved in California is very much shifted by my conversations with Karen. So thank you, Karen Clopton. And I have a pile of photos, and I'm going to try and tell this as a visual narrative. So stop me or slow me down or look appalled or whatever. But I think I do want to start in response to something Matthias said about this being a depressing story, because either sooner or later somebody's going to say, how did you live with this story? You know, how painful and distressing. And I have to say that every instance of 250 years of slavery in California, people fought back, and fought back in ways, as somebody who was born in LA, went through high school in LA, then did my BA and MA at Berkeley before I left the country. Not because of my California education, but that this was a story I didn't know. And in the not knowing, the history of the slavery came first. But immediately alongside every episode of human bondage is a story of resistance that I didn't know. From I don't know how many of you have been to California, have ever been to the missions, but I didn't know that there were slave revolts at every mission in California, and that they were orchestrated, coordinated between different missions that were close to each other geographically. I didn't know until I started working with Gabrielle Foreman in African American studies. I didn't know that there were colored conventions. There were over 1,000 colored conventions in the United States leading up to and soon after the Civil War, where Black folks gathered, sometimes hundreds of people. We now even have the menus of those conventions for those of you who like to really get into the human fabric of these stories, where starting in the 1820s, 1830s, Black people from all over the country gathered. And there were 4 colored conventions in California, 3 before the Civil War. And I just didn't know that at every episode of human bondage, there was well organized and, in fact, successful resistance. So I hope as I tell this pretty ragged story, and as we're all in the moment we're living in right now, where we don't get together with anybody without saying, what are we going to do? In those words, I think I've probably a direct quote from all of your breakfasts with your friends and family, that we have a map of different processes of resistance, of what we're going to do. And there are people who've led our way. And we may all differ on the appropriateness of what we're comfortable with, what suits our worldviews, but nothing of the most horrific brutality came down over these 250 years of history without resistance and successful resistance. So boy, do I hate starting out by correcting you. Um,
No, let me just add to that actually. So this is also one organizing feature of Jean's book, right? There's a chapter on the depressing stuff, and then there's a chapter on the agency of resistance and for all of these stories. So it did not mean to downplay that.
no, thank you. No, the book is written in pairs of chapters of human bondage and resistance. And we'll talk about how I define slavery, but also the forms of resistance are very particular to the people, to what they wanted, to how they were held and taken, and how they fought back. So they're twinned chapters that go through the book. In so we are calling this talk California a Slave State, but I also want to give it the subtitle of Justice That Repairs, because one, I believe in it, and I won't be able to make it through the next at least 2, if not 4 years without believing that there is justice that repairs. That's my husband over there, Peter Panuthos. He's a judge, and we believe in justice in different ways, but we both believe in it, that it happens. So in 1865, an ad appears in the elevator. The elevator was one of the Black newspapers in California, and it says, information wanted of Andrew Dennis and Richard Dennis, generally called Dick, last heard of 6 years ago in Cowiche County, Georgia. It is supposed they joined the Union Army, and the brother's mother, their brother George Dennis, and their sister Cordelia are looking for them. And California was 1,500 miles from the nearest slave state. But as the Civil War is ending, the Dennis family in California posts this ad. And if we think about people looking for their people, um, following the Holocaust, following 9/11, where I have very vivid images of people walking up and down the wards in hospitals with photographs, looking for their people. And of course, post slavery, and immediately, I mean, this is within weeks of the signing of the 13th Amendment, that people want their families and they need to find them. And these were families that were sold apart, and their people were forcibly taken, marched across the plains to California from Mississippi, Alabama, Missouri, by plantation owners to work in the gold rush. So that ad to me speaks to the urgency of people wanting their people back and needing to find their families. This map, oops, this map is from 1857, and it led us into the Civil War. It's commonly called the Reynolds map, and it's color coded. Um, the pink, the green, and the gray. I can't find a good place for this. The pink, the green, and the gray. The gray are what were designated as slave states. The green were the new territories, and under acts like the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the decision was going to be, do they enter the Union as free states or slave states? But there's a lot wrong with this map. And for one thing, they have California a free state. California um, enters the Union in 1850, and was required before it could be admitted into the Union. As every state, it was required to write a constitution. And in the California Constitution that was drafted by 40 white guys, 8 Latino men, no women were allowed in, and of the 40 white men, 25 were slaveholders. So that's who wrote our Constitution. And in it, they say slavery will never be tolerated in California. That was the deal. But they had an out immediately because tolerated is not a legal standard. So right away, right from the get-go, their ticket to ride had an out written into its language. People ask me how I define slavery for the purposes of this investigation. And there are many, many words for unfree people, people held in human bondage. Here are some, and they don't all apply to everybody, but they have a lot in common. Chattel, debt peons, unwilling prostitutes, indentured field hands, convict laborers, and I turn you to Robin Bernstein, who has just done an incredible study of convict labor in the East. And she's here, she's Harvard. Victims of human trafficking, plantation slaves. Unlike in the South, the enslaved people in California were not forced to reproduce themselves. But in effect, a mom isn't going to go far from her kid if she can, if she can stay and raise her children. So there was separation, but that wasn't a legal definition of a slaveholder's right to own the child of an enslaved woman, as it was in most places in the South. Inevitably, the child was enslaved too, but the true philosophy, the horrific terror, was captivity and the violent methods of control: kidnap, sexual assault, forced mobility, and we'll talk a lot about forced mobility, um, work without wages, ownership of one's body, as well as ownership of one's labor, starvation and seizing food supplies were a way of capturing people, and especially for Native Americans, seizing land. So California adopted and raised a deformed beast. Frederick Douglass calls slavery a many-headed hydra, and this hydra slithered across the state. What Douglass said is that with slavery, you chop off one head and two heads grow in its place. And this is the story of how slavery spread in California as it was victoriously and with tremendous loss and pain put down in one place. Um, it pops up again for the purposes of control, land, profit, unpaid labor, and involuntary sex. It pops up everywhere and slithers across the state. The theorist Saidiya Hartman said that slaves may be people, but they're, quote, civilly dead because they are incapacitated legal insiders. Incapacitated legal insiders. They are residing within the law. Their human bondage is legalized. And with slavery, it turns men, women, and children into property. I've been thinking a lot in the past 3 weeks about the collapse of the social contract, and that the social contract, in effect, all of the things that are unwritten, but things that we're expected to do and that we expect the government to do, are collapsing. And this feels very real to me living now in Washington, D.C. But it's the social contract that binds an area, a place, a space, a country together. Um, and this is what I see falling apart, and this is what gets violated with human bondage. So here's what's wrong with this map. Um, First of all, it only refers to African Americans, and only, of course, does not mean to diminish in any way the human bondage of, I believe it's 4 million, 4 million human beings. Um, but it excludes Native Americans, Chinese migrants, and convicts. And the story is also about the birth of the carceral state before the end of the Civil War in California. Generally, we think of the birth of convict labor as a replacement for slavery in the South. But in California, it happens in the 1850s, before Reconstruction. It's also um, a history that challenges the North-South binary of slavery. We now know, of course, that there was slavery all over the North. It built slavery, enslaved people, built universities, that we know that at one point New York threatens to secede, and it's because of the port in New York. Cotton is coming north, and New York is thriving because of its port, where cotton is then shipped across to mills across the north. Um, and the North and New York is afraid that if slavery comes to an end, the port will collapse and the economy of New York will collapse. So all of these things are stitched together in very horrific spaghetti. Um, that This is also an empire story. California is controlled by a sequence of four empires: Spain, Russia, Mexico, and finally the United States. And I go into that more in the book. But this is a global story where it's all coming together in a state that was supposed to not, quote, tolerate slavery. But slavery is always violent. It turns human beings into profit, into, this is from Walter Johnson, the slavery historian. It turns human beings into, quote, profit, fancies, sensations, and possessions. And I'd like to dwell, as we look at these images, on the idea of fancies, what people projected onto other human beings. It was, as Johnson said, world-making violence. So I'm exposing what was a hidden history, a violent history, a history of slave revolts, but it wasn't hard to find. Somebody before we started asked me, where did I find this history? Danae, I think you asked me that. And um, the scary thing for me as a Californian and a scholar of American studies is it is sitting right at the surface of the history I was taught. And I was very lucky. I studied with the grandpa of American studies. I studied with Kenneth Stamp, who did some of the original work on slave history. And yet I never knew what was happening on the Berkeley campus in terms of Native American slavery, in terms of Native American collection of human bodies, of human bones. It's well beyond blankets and baskets that Berkeley owned. But all of slavery somehow extracts profit from the human body through threat, through violence, invasion, removal, dispossession, land, and culture. So for those of you in the business, I'm rewriting the notion of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, which is a phrase that's come back as we look at Gaza, but settler colonialism talks about conquest through settling the land. But what I'm adding to that is that it also involves conquest of the human body. It isn't just the land. And as we extend our conversations about reparations, different groups of people want different things. And some of them are free tuition, some of it is cold cash. But for Native Americans, we can't have that conversation without land. No conversation with Native Americans about justice doesn't include the idea of returning land. And we'll come back to that. So we need to add race and bigotry to our history of slavery in the West and race as a force of extinction. Native Americans, and this is a number that seems generally agreed upon right now, when the Spanish invade California, they were the first enslavers. There is no history of slavery in Native American tribes in California. Um, Occasionally there was a captive. The captive was exchanged for bride price, whatever, but there is no institutional slavery in the Native American tribes in California. Partly it is so lush in California, and we know what scarcity does. We know what scarcity of money, scarcity of time, scarcity of sex. We know what it does. And California was so lush that there were 250 tribes, and for the most part, they really lived in peace. They didn't have borders, they didn't have fixed territories, and they, for the most part, had no notion of ownership. And the phrase that comes out now of stewardship really speaks to the relationship of Native Americans to the land of California. There was also the assault of disease, the assault by biology. Where measles is on all of our minds now. I just Googled because I had really bad measles as a kid, and I just Googled, do I need the 2 vaccinations? And I had it bad enough. Folks, I don't need those vaccinations, but you guys, um, so measles and also syphilis, that this is a highly gendered story. And this is the story of the power of rape, the threat of rape, sexual assault, selling and renting human bodies. What slavery did was sever family ties, like in the Dennis family. Um, and it's a story of lost and found. And the lost and found is people, but it's also history. Diaries, newspapers, court testimonies, letters, church archives, museums hold the story, and those institutions were often built by enslaved people. So I'm extending then the concept of abolition as well as the concept of slavery. And I want to talk about the birth of civil rights, especially through the colored convention movement in California. Every group then demanded justice, every group demanded the end of slavery, demanded freedom, and they all, in one form or another, demanded reparations. So this is an incomplete map, but it is the map that took us into the Civil War. Nope.
Might not be.
Maybe I'm upside down.
Yeah. Not you, but the clicker.
No, I've never had to give a talk upside down. Just maybe people thought that this is one of the reasons I wrote this book. In 2015, I saw in the Eureka Times Standard this image. This was a 15-year-old girl. She was homeless. She was wandering the streets of Hollywood, and she gets picked up by a guy who offers her a home and a sanctuary. And he says, "Come with me, I'll take care of you." She's young. She gets in the car with him, and he drives her the length of the state up to Lake County. And Lake County is the lowest populated county, I believe, or the second lowest in California. It's inland, it's hot, and it's the center of a lot of the marijuana grows in California. He's a grower, and he drives her up to his grow, up to his farm, and he locks her in that crate. And he drills 2 holes in the crate, and one is to hose her down, and the other is to poke her with a cattle prod. And he lets her out in August and September, early October, to harvest the plants, which is when pot ripens, and to sexually service the other field workers and, of course, himself up in Lake County. One day he and his partner take her down to Sacramento, the state capital, and they lock her in a motel room while they go out shopping to resupply the grow and the farm. And she's in a motel, locked in, and she looks around and sees a telephone, dials 911, calls the police, and frees herself. Takes the guys to court, and they go to jail. So both the horror I'm seeing in your faces, as well as the guts of this girl, 15 years old, homeless, desperate, and kept in that, to know to call 911 and to take these guys to trial and get them convicted and in jail is, to me, a really inspiring story of a young girl's courage. I don't think as a 15-year-old in LA, I could have put that liberation together. So that story was one of the reasons I felt this was a story that needed to be researched. And I felt like, as a Californian, as a woman, as a mom of 2 daughters, as a historian, as somebody who'd been active in the civil rights movement since the 60s, that this was a story I was duty bound to tell, and hopefully that I was able to tell it. I have too many toys here. This is an African American miner. He was brought out to work for his plantation owner in the gold fields. He was marched across the plains without over dramatizing it. Many of the settlers to California were marched across the plains because they took too much stuff with them. It's like me coming up here for 3 days, you just take too much stuff. And along the trails to California, people came upon furniture and pictures and mirrors and clothing and food and supplies. What had to remain were them, their children, and the animals. And their mining equipment. It was not cheap to cross the plains, and many plantation owners would take 3 or 4 enslaved people with them across the plains. Many, many more men than women. About 92% of the African Americans who crossed the plains were men, and the women were brought either as family or as servants or as midwives and nurses. Enslaved African Americans were on these wagon trains. And if you look through the newspapers of the time, there are ads for separate wagon trains with hundreds of wagons that are designated to bring enslaved people. They did not go in integrated wagon trains across the plains. So as I looked at the history, I kept asking, what happened to the 13th Amendment? When people say it didn't happen or they question me, I have a bunch of these ads. And I don't want to actually put words to it and read it myself, but you can read it. And these are ads that you think you would find along the Mississippi, in Louisiana, Alabama, Missouri, of ads for the sale of human beings to be sold at public auction. This is a Negro man agreed to set sail in preference to being sent home. So these are ads. This one is from the San Francisco Examiner. So they're all over California in the Sacramento and the San Francisco newspapers, and sometimes in the newspapers of small towns. In 1820, the United States passes what came to be called the Missouri Compromise, and it was a brutal trifecta. What the Missouri Compromise agreed, and then it evolves, is that after the Mexican, I grew up learning was the Mexican-American War. Mexican people call it the War Against Mexico. What is agreed afterwards is in this trifecta, California would be free. Utah and Nevada could choose whether they wanted to enter the country free or enslaved. And the third part, the most dangerous part, is part three was that Congress would pass the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And that basically said, bluntly, any Black person in the North could be targeted as a runaway, seized, and sold. And so for many free Blacks, they really wanted out of the North, that enslaved Blacks had no choice about coming to California, although some of them signed contracts, and we have these contracts saying if you work for X amount of time or you dig this much amount of gold, you can buy your freedom. Those were bogus contracts. And when they came to enforce those contracts, they, for the most part, weren't honored, and enslaved Blacks had to return again and again and again to raise more money. But free Blacks came because they wanted the same thing everybody, hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world, mainly men, wanted, was money, gold, those gold flecks in our rivers, freedom, get away from home. There were depressions. China had just had the Taiping Rebellion and was destitute. 6 million people die in the Taiping Rebellion. So a lot of Chinese men choose to come to California. And free Blacks from the North also wanted to come to California. They have a big duke out with Frederick Douglass, and Douglass says, "You can't go. We are at the peak of the abolition movement. If you leave now, it's almost like the Back to Africa movement. You will be abandoning the struggle for freedom in the United States." And they go, "Fred, get it together." One is we're entitled for the first time in our lives, where in many states we're not allowed to hold property, we're entitled to a share of the profit from the gold rush. But also, we've got the Fugitive Slave Act at our back, and we are out of here. And Douglass cuts a deal with people I'd never heard of, but they were leaders in California of the abolitionist movement, and I'll say their names. Mifflin Wistar Gibbs was one. Peter Lester and his wife Susan Lester were leaders and trained. And Douglass says to Gibbs and Lester, "Travel with me for the summer. Organizing isn't easy. Let me teach you how to do it. And at the end of the summer, you go with my blessing." And Gibbs writes about this in his own slave narrative, which I never knew. Even with my feet in the literature department, I didn't know that there were these other slave narratives. And they travel, and Gibbs in particular travels with Douglass and Julia, and then goes out to California and immediately starts the freedom movement in California. So, California, a slave state, is a title, but it's also a claim and an argument. The South always wanted to extend plantation slavery to the West. And tobacco and cotton were horrible for the slavery, were horrible for the soil. By the time of the Civil War, but really by the time of the 1850s, soil in the South was crappy. It was dried up. It was used up by tobacco in particular, is really harsh on soil, and they knew that they wanted to extend slavery to the Pacific. They had already done it for Texas. By the time of the Civil War, Texas has 200,000 enslaved blacks. In fact, some people moving west said, we don't even have to pay to take our enslaved people from the South as far as Texas. We'll just buy them in Texas. And they did, and then finished the trip with African Americans from Texas who had been forced to work in the plantations. One of my heroes and somebody I would love to know is George Dennis, one of the Dennis family who wrote the ad. So Dennis is forced to cross the plains with his owner. He's from a plantation in Mobile, Alabama, and his owner was a gambler. And he takes George Dennis, his name, and they sail down the coast, past the coast of Mexico to Panama, where the Chagres River comes into the Atlantic, and he forces George Dennis to carry his gambling tent. He's not going to mine, he's going to make his money another way. And George carries this 30-foot canvas tent across the jungles of Panama. Sometimes they find a canoe, sometimes they don't, then down the other side, and they have to wait for a long time for a ship. There are thousands of people waiting in Panama to go up to San Francisco for the gold rush. And they're charging an extra $350 for George, his dad is also George, to take him to San Francisco because he's Black. So they go up, and on the voyage, 4,000-mile voyage from Panama up to San Francisco Bay, they gamble George. George is I thought about him when Trump talked about how many cards he was holding, with Zelensky. They gamble George. When they're out of money, they're gambling who's going to own George Dennis. They get to San Francisco, to Portsmouth Square, where, for those of you who know the Bay Area, it's right by Chinatown. And they set up their gambling tent in Portsmouth Square in San Francisco. And at this point, George Dennis is forced to work as a porter for this gambling tent. And he keeps picking up the change that the drunken gamblers are dropping on the ground, collects $1,000 and buys his freedom. And he stays working for his former owner until he raises $900 to buy his mom's freedom, brings mom, and they're all last name Dennis. So you can just fantasize the relations and the assaults that created this family. Brings mom to San Francisco, right next door to that gambling tent, the El Dorado, that George and his mom set up their own gambling tent and hotel, and they make loads of money, and he buys a stable and a furniture shop, and he donates all of the money to abolition in California. And they're very successful, and they become very rich. So he is one of my heroes. There are other heroes. There were the men they call blackjacks, and blackjacks were sailors who, many of whom had fled from the South, or free blacks from the North, and they get jobs on ships. And so the black sailors are called blackjacks, and they're working these ships. But what they were was an incredible source of information, because as they sail around, they are telling other people, this ship is going to leave to go back to New Orleans, and it's got these Black people held in the hull of this ship, and it told the free Black community who was there when the ship was leaving, and many free Blacks would burst into those ships told by the blackjacks and rescue people and free them and then take them to other parts of California. The the first slaves in California were at the Franciscan missions. This was one of the early Franciscan missions, and of course, this is Junipero Serra crosses the border at Tijuana into San Diego with 100 Spanish soldiers and 8 fanatical priests. And they start to build the chain of 21 missions that were built on Native American slavery. And this obviously wasn't in 1769 because they didn't have the camera, as Robin would remind me. But this is what they looked like. But I want to point out that what was in this building, because every one of the buildings, the Spanish missions, had a room that was called a muñeras. And a muñeras was, in translation, the women's dormitory. It was a slave broker's place where at night, both the Spanish soldiers and the priests would come in and pick a woman to assault that night and take her out to somewhere in the mission and assault her. The women that remained were forced to sing very loudly, to sing over the sounds of sex. And then the women would be returned to the muñeras, and many of them were young girls. The muñeras were for teenage girls and women, married or not. So as we look at these buildings now looking like in ruins, this isn't the Taco Bell architecture that we think about now. The first slave revolt in California was in 1775, so it's within 5 years of conquest. And this is the San Diego mission, and the Kumeyaay people, one of the largest tribes in Southern California. It goes from northern San Diego County, it goes east, and it also goes down through, the tribe goes down through Baja California. It was an enormous tribe. They had spoken with each other. They knew the Spaniards were coming from the south, and the name we all know is Father Junipero Serra, who was sainted in 2015, sainted by the Pope, who then makes a big speaking tour in California that was protested by Native Americans all over the West and the Southwest for his sainthood, many of whom were Catholic people, and yet protesting the sainting of Father Junipero Serra. In fact, we have a very popular radio show in DC, an Afro-Caribbean guy, he's terrific, Kojo Nnamdi, been on that show more than once. And I'm listening, I'm driving, and I'm hearing that the Pope is coming to DC, and there's somebody really promoting celebrations of the sainthood of Junipero Serra. And I pull over and I call the producer and say, and it was Q&A time. So I say, I want to ask this question. And they bounce me to another producer, and I'm watching my watch, like you only get 5-10 minutes for phone-ins. And they come back and say, the producers decided you won't be allowed on the show. And this is our NPR, and I deeply admire Kojo, but something that this questioning of the sainthood of Junipero Serra was not allowed on the Kojo Nnamdi show. This is the first slave revolt. This is what I wanted to call in and talk about. It's where the Kumeyaay people plan to free their Kumeyaay brethren who have been held at the San Diego mission. And it takes a few months. They build new arrows, new bows, new slivers of stone to fire the arrows. And they sweep down all together and free their people, and they murder the head priest, Father Jaime, and that's Father Jaime there. And this was actually an engraving done by one of the padres at the mission. And so this is the first slave revolt in California by the Kumeyaay people. And of course, this is how the missions are now promoted as Technicolor, Touristica, consumed by looking, consumed by sailing. consumed by selling and by vision. And this was the San Diego mission, founded in California, 1769. It counters the other image of the San Diego mission that we just looked at. The next slavery to come into California is the Russians are come across the Bering Strait. So we're moving way up the coast. Now, these are the Aleutian Islands that connect Russia to what is now Alaska. And the Alaska natives, and there were about 40 or 50 tribes, were all skilled otter hunters. The deal with the otter is it's the softest, silkiest animal in the world. It's got 1,000,000 hairs per square inch. It's softer than sable, softer than mink. And the Russians get lost, and Bering crashes on one of these islands, but his sailors discover the sea otter. And it starts this trade in the sea otter. They're sold in China, and they are sailing up through the Aleutian Islands. Word gets back to Russia. In some places, there's only 20 miles separation of Russia from Alaska. Word gets back about the sea otters, and there is an invasion. It's a rush. They call it soft gold. And there's a rush to capture the sea otters. And when they've decimated the tribes, they turn right and sail down the coast. And they settle right about there in California, but they dump the Alaska natives and Alaska Native women who they needed to sew the waterproof clothing that's made out of the long gut of a seal. So they bring with them a few women, and they travel with their kayaks to slaughter the sea otters that grow along the Pacific coast. And the Spanish are up to there by now. The Russians are coming down from the north. And so they dump the Alaska natives on the Farallone Islands. Any of you who've been in San Francisco Bay know that these are just rocky outposts, and they would dump the Alaska natives. The tribes have been thoroughly decimated by the Russians for up to 6 months to kill the sea otter, and then they would come by with a bag of flour, leave the bag of flour, and take the sea otters and sell them in China. So if you picture images of Chinese mandarins with a furry collar, a furry cuff, around the bottom of their robes and their sleeves, those are California and Alaska otters that the mandarins are wearing. So what I argue is that there was in fact a Pacific slave triangle from Alaska, California, China. And I talk more about that sale in the book. I can tell you that Putin, they build a fort called Fort Ross in Sonoma County. When I was in college, we would take sourdough bread and a bottle of wine, and we'd go up to Fort Ross and have a picnic. I had no idea I was picnicking on a slave plantation built by the Russians. And I've worked with Fort Ross and Cal Parks and some Alaskan natives to make sure that that story gets told to tourists. Putin believes he still owns a piece of California, and there's a fantastic article in Forbes magazine where he supports Fort Ross. This is Forbes. This isn't my radical press. That he is keeping in the basement of the Ritz-Carlton in Paris a group of French Impressionist paintings. And when Fort Ross needs more money, that they go and sell one of the Impressionist paintings, and a chunk of that money goes to support Fort Ross. And Putin still believes that he owns this piece of America. And who knows, This is an image painted at the time of one of the Alaska natives. The Russians traveled with watercolorists the way later explorers traveled with the camera. And this is a painting by Louis Chorice. And it's you could spend a lot of time analyzing this painting, but that's what the kayaks looked like. The men had helmets that were sun visors, um, and they would strap the otters. It took 3 days to kill and beach an otter, and it's marked as a controlling image by one of the ships, at the top of the frame of the picture. And this was from Alaska. The collection of Chore's paintings is at the Beinecke at Yale. And someday I could do a cocktail table book, of the Chore's watercolors. This is one of the most painful. We're going to have Q&A, okay? Because if you stop me now, I'm really hosed. Okay. This is probably the most brutal and difficult image that we'll look at today. In 1850, California passes its very first act. Its very first act, and it's right after the Constitution is signed, and it's the Act for the Government and Protection of the Indian. The Government and Protection of the Indian. And it legalizes the kidnap, forced indenture, and sale of Native Americans in California. This girl was forced to be a nanny, and it's also a studio portrait. So maybe Robin, who knows photography, could tell us more. But who would take this girl who was a wet nurse, breastfeeding a white baby, and our Mexican American daughter has said that's the whitest baby she's ever seen, and pose this picture with this woman's very full breasts. And those of you who've breastfed will understand the breasts of the woman we're looking at there. And yet this is also a Madonna child kind of framing send up with a very cruel mockery of this. Her clothes were not Native American clothes. It's probably a Spanish type cape of some sort, but it was taken in Sacramento in a studio. And there are only 2 photos like this of nannies, of Native American nannies that I've found. But this is the most painful story, and she looks very, very young to me. And her expression of despair and really despising this child, which is quite understandable. So she was legally, getting back to the notion of legal within the law, she was legally kidnapped, indentured, and sold. Boys could be sold until they were 25. Girls could be sold until they were age 35, but she's quite young. And then the law is re-upped in 1860, just as we're headed into the Civil War, a war about slavery. This is a Chinese girl. The Chinese men came free for the gold rush. Chinese girls were kidnapped from the port cities of Guangdong up through Macau, and which is past, I guess, where we would bracket. And she was taken often in a padded crate. Hundreds and hundreds of young Chinese girls were kidnapped or sold by their destitute parents. And we have the contracts, and sold into 4 years of forced prostitution. They were strip searched at the docks in San Francisco. So if we think New Orleans, think San Francisco. They were strip searched at the docks. The girls who weren't sold were taken into Chinatown and sold in a slave broker's area called the Queen's Room. Some of them were taken up to the Gold Rush country, but most of them were sold from caged brothels. She was forced to solicit her customers. And I have a couple of other pictures of enslaved prostitutes, and they're all holding this scroll. And nobody can give yet an explanation of what that scroll was, because she was very likely illiterate. So it couldn't be a record of her sales. There was a curtain. The curtain would be opened, she would solicit a customer, she would service a customer. All sorts of men from every race were the customers of the girls, these very young girls in Chinatown. The girls didn't live long. They died of abuse, of being beaten, of disease. And the ones I've been particularly interested in are the ones who fled, because the girls who fled started the Chinatowns across rural California in areas like Marysville. And then after she services the customer, hands her the money to her owner, who would have been the wife of a Chinese merchant. Um, the curtain is open and she does it again. And in the few transcripts I found, court transcripts, and also in Judy Young's amazing book, um, Unbound Feet and Unbound Voices, they service 20 men a day. I cannot picture, I cannot picture, I can't picture that much sex, 20 times a day. Um, the attraction was that Chinese girls were supposed to be docile, subservient, willing, passive. There was also a biological myth that the Chinese women had horizontal rather than vertical vaginal slits. And so if you didn't have the money for a full sexual service, you could pay for, and it was called at the time a lookie, for 75 cents. Moving forward chronologically, and the resistance was these girls fled and fled across California. There are cases where they slaughtered their customers. Many of them died of abuse, of syphilis. But they also, I just found a girl named Chui Lai, and Chui Lai turns to the 14th Amendment to argue for her right to birthright citizenship. So as Trump goes after birthright citizenship, and we look at the case of Wong Tong Ark, the first birthright citizenship case, Chui Lai's case for her right to birthright citizenship, to re-enter the country because she was born here and she was a citizen, anticipates his. Moving on towards Native American boarding schools, that there were 12 boarding schools, Indian boarding schools in California. The biggest one was in Riverside in the middle of the orange groves. And the kids, and they copied the model from Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. Day one, the kids had their hair cut. They were never again allowed to speak their native language. They're dressed, the boys are dressed in these scratchy kind of faux military clothes, and they're sent into an outing program. And when I first heard outing, it had a different sort of current reference for me of somebody being outed. But the outing program was to send all of the children at the Indian boarding schools out to work unpaid. And the girls worked in hotels, in boarding houses, in domestic service, and the boys worked in the fields. This is a classroom where the girls are being taught to iron. This is not a laundry. This is also from Sherman in Southern California. Here the children are grubbing for food, for their own food and their own survival before they're even old enough to be sent out. Also from Sherman. And this is a class photo. The kids were kidnapped. The United States passes the Indian Education Act that requires Native Americans to have schooling, but there were no schools on the reservations. It was a straight path to the outing programs for the Indian boarding schools to take these kids and make a profit off of them by selling them into servitude. I'm running out of time. We're not going to get through this whole slide deck, but the next phase of slavery in California were convict laborers. From the gold rush on, there were ships in San Francisco Bay. There were 400 ships in San Francisco Bay where captains and sailors have brought out gold miners. around the Horn, no Panama Canal yet, to worry about. And they come into San Francisco and they realize that their passengers are headed up to the gold country to make loads of money. And they decide to literally abandon ship. And California gives a contract to a really corrupt guy, James Edsel, to set up a system of convict labor. He buys one of these ships that's just floating in the bay and turns it into a prison brig. And this one was taken from San Francisco Bay up to Sacramento. It was called the LaGrange. So everything from here up is a prison. And Edsel sails the ship for several years around the bay. He's building mansions with prison labor that he is told that he owns. Um, so he's building mansions, but he's also working for the county of San Francisco, building roads, building sewage systems, but they're paying money to Edsel. Finally, the state legislature says, build the darn prison, and he builds San Quentin Prison. And in the basement of San Quentin Prison, he builds a factory, and it's to make jute bags for the new California agriculture. That California is now growing wheat. Wheat flies around, it needs to be contained. California didn't have a system of grain elevators. And so the wheat had to be packed in these jute bags. The jute is grown in Calcutta on, on jute plantations owned by the Brits. So this is a global kind of slavery where in the basement of San Quentin, they are taking jute, which is like burlap, weaving it into the bags, selling them at a loss to the new California agriculture. And you're required to work and stand in silence 12 hours a day. There is no way I could be silent for 12 hours a day under any circumstances, nor could I stand for 12 hours. And if you moved away from your loom, or if you talked, or had to take care of your body, you were tortured. This is waterboarding. Robin, you may be familiar with this image. And it says, a Negro convict Moore showered to death. This is the birth of waterboarding. And it was a torture in the convict labor system in the East Coast and then copied in San Quentin Prison for the jute business. I feel like I want to leave time for some questions. So we're going to leave this story in the middle and buy the book. I really am happy to stick around and answer your questions or show anybody who wants the rest of the slides. But for now, let's open this up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean, I'm afraid I have to leave you to fielding your own questions since I have to leave, but maybe we can just go on for another 15 minutes, whoever wants to stay. And
if anyone wants to stay, yeah, we can do this.
Yeah.
We teach.
And so I should have reminded you at the beginning, we're actually recording this. So, you're always encouraged to introduce yourselves, as you ask a question, but just kind of, you don't have to since we're recording.
Yeah, I'm sorry not to take your question earlier.
Oh, no worries. Sorry for interrupting. Sorry. My name is Luke Thornton Atkins Barnett. I'm from Dallas, and I have one of the most high-profile slave-owning and white supremacist lineages at Harvard. And I'm also a disabled LGBT activist who doesn't associate with a lot of those people in my family. And yeah, your anecdote about Fort Ross, and how some of these French Impressionist paintings, were used covertly to help fund some of this like Pacific slave trade stuff. Like I can confirm from direct sources that I no longer have access to that this is true. So at Fort Ross, my great grandfather was Governor Ross Barnett. He was a white supremacist who imprisoned the Freedom Riders. He was the governor of Mississippi, and he was a white supremacist. All of that. He had a part in that. And then my father, his name is Elmer Buford Atkins III. He's an oil and gas CEO narcissist whose net worth is estimated at $1 billion, and I don't talk to him anymore. He does bi-monthly trips to Kansas City at the Nelson Atkins Museum. And yeah, all of that being said, I've seen some of these resources because I've looked into our slave owning past. And from Fort Ross, to some of the banks, and museums in Sacramento. If you're familiar with Charles Crocker, for example, who was president of Central Pacific Railroad. Um, all of that being said, yeah, with the French Impressionist anecdote, on Fort Ross, I remember studying that in 2022 and 2023, and that's true, and it's something that still goes on today. Um, you know, uh, Kansas City, Louisiana, Texas, all of that, they use, and you see this, like if you've seen Tenet, the Christopher Nolan film, where they talk about using, museums and forts and banks and all of that. They use that, and slavery is still an issue, a massive issue today, and you see it in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, etc. So all of that being said, I don't have much of an academic, presentation right now. I was just going to say from, personal experience that I read that stuff about Fort Ross, and thank you for sharing. And yeah, my dad has an art collection, and they change the valuations, and that's something that's used, for some of these bad things, just like, the diamond trade and some of these other, anecdotes. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a current story, and I haven't had a chance to take the Forbes story, and I probably wouldn't have shared it had it come from a source other than Forbes, um, which which talks about the support of um, of Fort Ross, and to get the story of the plantation story of Fort Ross. If you go there, it's wonderful little butter cookies, and they dress the girls in aprons, and they give the boys wooden rifles to pretend that they're back in the early days, and yet that this was a major nexus of Alaska Native people, and they're the ones who've really been the leaders in getting the other story to Fort Ross. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm Helena Malikova. I'm a fellow at the Carr Center. I would like to ask about the role of Black capitalism in resistance. I don't see a lot of this kind of capitalism, Black capitalism type of ideas in Europe when we're talking currently about anti-racist movements. And I know that there has been this happening in the US, and kind of, was it successful? You mentioned this slave that managed to free himself, and it sounded like
Yeah, I think that the notion of Black capitalism is a little early for this story, and maybe other people can add to it. Karen can maybe add to it, but really, the people, the African Americans, for the most part, who came to California, came, if they were free, they didn't have a lot of resources. And there were incredibly interesting Black merchants in California. Mifflin Wistar Gibbs, who I talked about, and Peter Lester opened a boot emporium in San Francisco. And they refuse, they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to own property, but they have one of the quote finest boot emporiums in the West. It's actually nationally advertised, and they are being charged $3 for a poll tax to vote. And Gibbs and Lester decide not to pay the poll tax. The cops come in and take all the boots out of the store to sell in the streets of San Francisco at a big auction. And people wandered through the crowd. There's a huge crowd. They're saying, don't buy any. Nobody buys any shoes. And it's a peaceful boycott that works. And all of the shoes go back into the store. Both Lester and Gibbs are leaders in the colored convention movement and the abolitionist movement in California. But I think the notion of an evolution of Black capitalism is just premature for the story that I have. Karen, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would just commend you to look into Leadsdorf from
Yeah.
San Francisco, who
Yeah, Williams Leigdorf.
was a financier and was mayor of San Francisco, who was Black. and also Mary Ellen Pleasant, who financed John Brown and the Harper's Ferry rebellion. And she was a Black woman who uh, she and her husband acquired great wealth, and that's what they did with it. They were very engaged in the abolition movement, if
Ye-
that's what you're
Yeah,
talking
and
about.
I
Yeah.
mean, but I think that Mary Ellen Pleasant, who is a fascinating character and partly fascinating because we keep hearing new and contradictory stories about Mary Ellen Pleasant, and I don't know that the definitive biography of her. She owned a chain of boarding houses, but maybe they weren't boarding houses, maybe they were brothels. But she made a great deal of money, and the money went, and the money that she gave to John Brown's raid, she was at the meeting in Ontario that John Brown's raid was planned, and she donated a great deal of money. It's unclear how much money she donated. She inherited some from her first husband, but her then husband, her current husband, was a guy named John Riker. And if I have this right, and John Riker was a blackjack. And he is the one that's informing the free Black population in San Francisco about the ship sailing, that he was really instrumental in communicating what was going on. I can't quite figure out the money in that family of did he stay as a reasonably low level person on the ship in order to um, be part of an underground movement to free Black people, because the free Black community in San Francisco knew when a ship was about to sail with a Black person on it who was being returned to the South. Mary Ellen Pleasant's husband informs the free Black community that a guy who I didn't have time to talk about today, named Archie Lee, was a enslaved fugitive who runs in California time after time after time. And the free Black community is pretty much broke supporting all of his lawsuits, which they do. And in fact, he's one of the first Blacks to be able to testify on his own behalf as to his status as a free person and take his case to court. He wins that case. There is a huge celebration of his freedom because he was sort of like the heart, the Newton, the Huey Newton of the time. People knew of this case. And there's a big gathering celebration at the AME Church in San Francisco. A guy walks in and he's been sent by the governor of British Columbia. And he comes with an offer to Black people in San Francisco and to say, you guys have it rough. We are going to have an election in British Columbia, and a man who was Caribbean, African, and part white, Douglas, who is the governor of British Columbia, and he comes with an offer, and he goes into this big celebration at the AME Church, unrolls the map, and he says, I've come as a representative of British Columbia to offer you 20 acres of land, the right to the welcome in the Episcopal Church, schooling for your children. And this is off now at Salt Island, which is off of Vancouver, and land, of course, it was Native American land, to settle on Salt Island or in Vancouver. Gibbs goes with this, the person who had just been freed, Archie Lee. They are on the first ship to sail to British Columbia because they wanted Archie out of there so he wouldn't be captured again. Mary Ellen Pleasant has funded the whole expedition to get Archie Lee and Mifflin Wistar Gibbs out. And they're some of the first Blacks, and 800 Blacks in about 3 weeks. It's called the Exodus in California Black history, are part of the Exodus. 800 free Blacks sail to British Columbia to have the vote, to have land, and they sit out the Civil War in British Columbia. Some of them remain. They're the Black settlers of British Columbia. And some of them, like Mifflin Wistar Gibbs, returns. He goes to Oberlin, goes to law school, and becomes one of the first Black municipal judges. Then he becomes ambassador to Madagascar. I don't haven't fully tracked him, but he was an incredible person. But it all flows back to the Exodus. But before that, it flows back to the fight to not pay the poll tax, the $3 poll tax in San Francisco. And before that, to being trained by Frederick Douglass on how to be an organizer. And it wasn't Gibbs' intention to flee until this crazy offer comes in the middle of the celebration of Archie Lee's freedom. It's a long answer, but I hopefully ties it together a bit for you. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shreya, and I'm from Delaware, and I'm currently a cross-registered student between MIT and Harvard. And thank you for your work and thank you for this talk, first of all. And what we're seeing, especially in this day and age, is this attack on education and this whitewashing of American education. So these stories are super important. And looking at the lessons of history, how do we resist these type of forces against our education and also our histories?
Yeah, I think we're in a really perilous time in terms of education, that the issue of it's not just in the South that there's book banning and censorship, and that I think we're going to see more and more. I can tell you that I had a Fulbright that's supposed to start April 13th to go to the Slavery Institute at the University of Bonn. And within days of the inauguration, I get a letter saying my Fulbright to study slavery, global slavery, at the Slavery Institute in Bonn has been canceled because it is, quote, no longer a priority. My research is no longer a priority of the United States government. So we have our work cut out for us. And I think those of us who teach, who have kids in the school system, grandkids in the school system, need to make education and demands for access to all kinds of learning, LGBTQ learning, the study of race, the study of slavery. I didn't expect, I mean, my 6-week specialist Fulbright is very low on the list of the harm that's happening in the world and in our country right now. But it hit us very hard that somehow they had found the code words for my little 6-week Fulbright, that within days of the inauguration, it's canceled. So it's happening at, in places of higher education, and it's happening in the schools. And I agree with you that it's urgent. One of the biggest demands of free Blacks in California was for access to education. The schools were segregated at best, or if there was no place for a Black kid to go to school, they just didn't get an education. And Peter Lister's daughter, Sarah, is expelled from an integrated school in California, and she's about to be sent to a very crummy public school that was not integrated. And that was part of why the Lesters got on the ship, the Commodore, and took the opportunity to go to British Columbia, had to do with his daughter being kicked out of the schools in San Francisco. So we're all searching for answers, but I do believe that education should be, one of our priorities to protect and fight for. And also for those of us who are in the education biz to really pay very close attention to what we're teaching right now and to have a very expansive, capacious notion of, of what needs to be taught in the schools. Other questions? Maggie.
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the time, but I want to thank you, Jean, again for being with us here tonight, and especially in this moment, your book and the paired structure and the examples of horrific oppression and then the examples of liberation and resistance are really meaningful in this historic moment that we're just entering. So thank you again for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for welcoming me.